From the very first moment, when a single tear glistened on my cheek at my mother's funeral and the cold wind carried whispers of lost love, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The air was thick with grief, memories, and an unspoken dread, as if the earth itself mourned her absence. And then came the shocking twist. My father, still unburdened by sorrow, had already found solace in another's arms. His voice, stern and unforgiving, echoed in my ears as he declared, "Accept the marriage or empty the home." In that instant, I felt trapped between the ghost of my mother's gentle warmth and a future forced upon me by his harsh decree. So I remember the day of my mother's funeral vividly, a day etched in my mind as both a farewell and a beginning I never wished for. The church was dimly lit, its stained glass windows filtering the late autumn sunlight into ghostly hues that danced on the worn wooden pews. I sat in the front row, my eyes red from crying, as family members whispered condolences and shared stories of her gentle kindness. Every word, every memory, was a bittersweet reminder of the woman who had always been my safe haven. Yet beneath the somber ritual of grief, an undercurrent of tension began to ripple through the crowd. I could feel the eyes of relatives glancing furtively at one another, their expressions a mix of sympathy and something else, something I couldn't quite place until later. After the service, as we gathered outside under a sky heavy with impending dusk, my father's unexpected announcement shattered the fragile solace I clung to. With the same resolute tone he had always used to command respect in our home, he announced that he had married someone new, someone who, as I later learned, was no stranger to our family's secrets. His words cut through the murmurs of mourning like a jagged shard of ice, "Accept the marriage or empty the home." In that moment, the familiar warmth of our family home, the one that had been filled with my mother's laughter and love, transformed into a battleground of conflicting loyalties and raw emotions. I stood frozen on the steps of the old house, my heart pounding in a mixture of disbelief and anguish. How could my father, still reeling from the loss of the one person who had been my entire world, choose to embrace a new life so quickly? The pain of my mother's absence was still fresh, and yet here he was, seemingly ready to erase the past with a single, decisive act. The ultimatum was clear and merciless: either I accepted this new union, with all its implications and the painful reminder of my loss, or I would have no place in the home that once cradled my happiest memories. In the days that followed, I found myself caught in a storm of conflicting emotions. Every corner of our once beloved home reminded me of my mother, the gentle hum of the kitchen as she prepared her favorite meals, the quiet nook in the living room where she had once read to me, the garden where she had planted roses with tender care. Now, these relics of my past were overshadowed by a looming sense of betrayal and abandonment. My father's decision, shrouded in an unexpected finality, forced me to confront a painful truth. I was expected to put aside my grief and submit to a future I never chose, a future defined by a man's need to move on rather than the natural, lingering process of mourning. I spent countless nights wandering the empty halls of the house, each step echoing with the silence of memories. I would trace my fingers over old photographs, trying to remember a time when my mother's smile lit up every room. In those quiet moments, the reality of my situation sank in deeper. The house, once a sanctuary of love and laughter, had become a stage for an ultimatum I could neither negotiate nor ignore. My father's words haunted me relentlessly: accept the marriage or leave everything behind, the very foundation of my identity, the remnants of a past that I desperately clung to. My inner turmoil was compounded by the reactions of those around me. Some relatives urged me to be understanding, to see my father's remarriage as a step toward healing. They spoke in measured tones of the inevitability of change and the need to embrace new beginnings. Others, however, looked at me with a mixture of pity and admonishment, as if I were being punished for clinging to the memory of my mother. Their stares and murmurs only deepened my sense of isolation and betrayal. I felt as though I were being forced to choose between my mother's memory, a sacred relic of the past, and a future that felt imposed upon me without compassion or dialogue. One particular evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, I sat alone on the back porch, staring into the dark void of the night. The moon hung low, a silent witness to my suffering, its pale light reflecting off the dew-laden grass. I found myself questioning everything. How could life be so cruel? How could a man, my own father, be so callous as to dismiss the pain of loss with such a cold ultimatum? I recalled my mother's gentle words and the tender care she had always shown me, and in that moment, I vowed that her legacy would not be forgotten. I would fight, not out of anger alone, but out of a deep-seated need to preserve the memory of who I was and what I had lost. Determined to find a way forward, I began to document every detail of this painful period in my journal. I poured my heart out onto the pages, capturing the raw intensity of my emotions, sorrow, anger, confusion, and a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim a part of the life that had been stolen from me. I wrote about the sound of my mother's voice in my memory, the laughter that once filled these walls, and the unyielding love that had defined her presence. In writing, I found a measure of solace, a way to organize the chaotic swirl of my feelings into something tangible, something that might eventually guide me toward healing. As the days turned into weeks, the reality of the situation began to demand more than silent reflection. I realized that I could no longer remain a passive victim of circumstances that were rapidly spiraling out of control. My father's remarriage, with its blunt ultimatum, was not just a personal affront, it was a call to action. I needed to confront him, to demand an explanation, to understand the reasoning behind a decision that had torn our family apart. This inner resolve grew stronger with each passing day, fueled by the images of my mother's gentle smile and the stark contrast of the cold, hard reality that now surrounded me. I summoned the courage to approach my father one rainy afternoon, when the world outside was as gray and somber as my mood. His study, lined with shelves of books and old family photographs, felt like an altar to a bygone era, a time when family meant more than expediency and personal ambition. I knocked softly on the door, my heart hammering in my chest, and waited. When he finally beckoned me in, his eyes, so different from the warm gaze I remembered, held a mixture of regret and defiance. "Dad," I began, my voice trembling with suppressed emotion, "I need to understand. Why now? After everything, why must I choose between accepting this new marriage or leaving the home that holds all our memories?" He leaned back in his chair, his face shadowed by the dim light. "It's not about choosing memories, it's about moving forward," he replied curtly, his tone dismissive yet edged with sorrow. "Your mother's passing has left a void, one that I can't fill with regret. I'm trying to rebuild, our family, my life, everything. And this is the way I see it." His words struck me like a blow, and I felt the weight of his indifference settle upon my shoulders. I wanted to scream, to demand that he see the pain his decision had wrought, but all I could manage was a choked whisper. That day marked a turning point, a moment when I realized that the journey ahead would require me not only to confront the legacy of loss but also to redefine my own identity in a world that no longer felt like home. That night, as I lay awake listening to the relentless patter of rain against my window, I vowed to honor my mother's memory in a way that was true to who I was. I resolved to stand up for my right to grieve, to remember, and to decide my own future, even if it meant challenging the very foundation of our fractured family. My path was uncertain, and the emotional terrain ahead promised to be fraught with heartache and hard choices, but I knew that I could no longer remain silent in the face of an imposed destiny. I ended that long night with a simple, determined thought. I would find a way to navigate this painful transformation, to reconcile the legacy of my past with the demands of an uncertain future. And so, with the memory of my mother's love as my guide and a heart steeled by the fires of betrayal, I stepped forward into the darkness, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, and determined to forge a new life on my own terms. In the wake of that shattering ultimatum, I awoke to a world transformed, a landscape of raw emotion and relentless uncertainty. The echoes of my mother's farewell still haunted the halls of my memory, mingling with the bitter taste of my father's uncompromising decree. Each morning, as I rose in my small, sparsely furnished room, the silence felt deafening, a constant reminder that everything I had known was irrevocably changed. I found myself caught between a longing for the warmth of a past that was gone and a present that demanded a painful, unwanted evolution. I had two choices: submit to a future dictated by my father's new life or sever the ties to the only home I'd ever known. So I chose to step into the tempest. The first weeks were a blur of restless nights and solitary days. I wandered through our empty house, each room a relic of happier times, a room where my mother's laughter once lingered in the soft rustle of curtains, a kitchen that still bore faint traces of her gentle touch in the lingering aroma of vanilla and cinnamon. Yet those memories, so tender and warm, now clashed violently with the stark reality of a home that no longer felt like home. I found myself questioning every decision that led to this moment, my thoughts a tangled web of grief, anger, and confusion. How could my father, who once embodied stability and protection, now insist on a life that felt alien to me? Determined to make sense of the chaos, I began a journey of both external inquiry and internal reflection. I reached out to family members, desperate for clues about my father's sudden transformation. Conversations with distant relatives revealed fragments of a hidden narrative, a past of unspoken grievances and unresolved conflicts that had festered quietly behind closed doors. One aunt recalled a conversation overheard during a family dinner years ago, hinting at a rift between my father and my mother that I had never known. Another cousin, with a furrowed brow and heavy heart, whispered about secrets my father had guarded so fiercely that even those closest to him remained in the dark. With every whispered account, I began to suspect that the ultimatum was not merely about a new marriage. It was the culmination of years of suppressed emotions and bitter resentments that had finally erupted into a force too powerful to contain. At the same time, the community around me was not silent. Neighbors, old friends, and even acquaintances from my school days started to share their own interpretations of the unfolding drama. Their voices, each tinged with sympathy, scorn, or resignation, painted a mosaic of opinions, some urging me to adapt, others warning me of the cost of stubborn pride. I listened to them all with a detached curiosity, yet none of their words could ease the personal ache that gnawed at my heart. In the midst of this cacophony of advice, I felt increasingly isolated, as if the tragedy of my loss and the shock of my father's rebirth were mine alone to bear. To find some semblance of solace and clarity, I turned inward. I dusted off an old journal, the one my mother had once gifted me, filled with blank pages meant for dreams and reflections, and began to write again. At first, my entries were jagged and raw, dripping with unfiltered anger and sorrow. I wrote about the suffocating pain of abandonment, the constant reminders of a past that I could neither escape nor fully embrace. But as days turned into weeks, the act of writing evolved into something more than a venting of grief. It became a quiet dialogue with my inner self. I questioned my own emotions, seeking to untangle the intricate interplay between loyalty to a lost mother and the bitterness of a father who had seemingly replaced that love with another. Slowly, my journal transformed into a map of my journey, each entry a stepping stone toward understanding the paradox of my situation. I began taking long walks through the city at dusk, when the light was soft and uncertain, much like the state of my heart. I sought out quiet corners of local parks, where I could sit in the embrace of nature and let my thoughts drift freely. In those solitary moments, I started to piece together a picture of who I wanted to become, regardless of the painful choices forced upon me. I discovered that amidst the chaos, there was an unexpected reservoir of resilience. Each step on those winding paths, every quiet breath taken under the vast sky, reminded me that life, however harsh it might seem, always held the potential for renewal. Concurrently, I knew that if I were to reclaim control over my destiny, I needed to confront my father directly. The confrontation wasn't driven solely by a desire for answers, it was a necessary step to free myself from the oppressive chains of resentment that threatened to define me. I reached out to him after several weeks of agonizing silence. I had rehearsed the conversation countless times in the solitude of my room, my heart heavy with both hope and dread. When we finally met in the muted light of an early winter afternoon at a quiet cafe away from the prying eyes of family and friends, the air between us was thick with unspoken truths. "Dad," I began, my voice tentative but resolute, "I need to understand. How can you ask me to choose between accepting this new marriage and staying in the home that holds everything I loved?" His eyes, which once shimmered with paternal warmth, now looked distant and clouded, as if burdened by regrets he couldn't articulate. He sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "I never intended for it to come to this," he murmured. "After your mother passed, I felt lost. I tried to find a way to move forward, to fill the void, and in doing so, I made decisions that hurt you. I thought it was the only way to rebuild what I'd lost." His words, though soft, reverberated with a sorrow that was as palpable as the ache in my own heart. I could see, for a fleeting moment, the vulnerability behind his stern exterior, the same vulnerability that perhaps he had long tried to hide, even from himself. The conversation was far from a cathartic resolution. Instead, it was a delicate dance of accusations, confessions, and the tentative hope of bridging a chasm that had widened over time. I expressed the anguish of being forced into a binary choice, one that seemed to erase the memory of my mother and replace it with a new narrative that felt foreign and imposed. I spoke of the countless nights spent in silent despair, of the suffocating loneliness that had become my constant companion. In response, he admitted his own guilt, the regret of decisions made in haste, and the painful realization that his attempts to move forward had left deep scars on those he loved most. Yet, even as we exchanged these revelations, the underlying tension persisted, each word a reminder of how irreversibly our lives had been altered. Leaving that meeting, I felt neither wholly vindicated nor completely shattered. Instead, I was left with a profound awareness of the complexities of loss, love, and the desperate need for human connection, even when it came wrapped in the guise of painful compromises. I realized that healing was not about erasing the past but about integrating it into a new, albeit uncertain, future. The confrontation had not provided me with all the answers I sought, but it had marked the beginning of a slow, tentative reconciliation with the man who had once been my rock, and with the reality that life does not always offer the clarity we so desperately crave. In the weeks that followed, I continued to navigate this turbulent terrain with cautious determination. I sought therapy to help process the overwhelming emotions, and through those sessions, I began to understand that my feelings of betrayal, loss, and anger were not isolated. They were part of a universal struggle to reconcile change with memory. I met others who had experienced similar family upheavals, and in sharing our stories, I found a sense of solidarity that eased the isolation I had felt for so long. Each session, each conversation, was a small victory in reclaiming my identity, a step away from the shadows of my mother's absence and my father's stern ultimatum, toward a future where I could define my own worth. I also delved deeper into creative pursuits as a way to channel my inner turmoil. I returned to painting, a passion I had long set aside in the wake of my mother's passing. With each brushstroke, I poured out the kaleidoscope of emotions that had become my constant companion. My canvases became a record of my journey, abstract swells of dark hues intermingled with bursts of vibrant colors that symbolized fleeting moments of hope and clarity. Over time, these creations began to take on a life of their own, evolving into a form of expression that not only provided solace but also resonated with others who had experienced similar betrayals. In the act of creation, I found a language that transcended words, a language that spoke directly to the heart of pain and the promise of renewal. As the months slipped by, I began to see subtle shifts within myself. The bitter anger that had once consumed me started to wane, replaced by a quiet resolve to build a future that honored both my past and the possibilities ahead. I learned to smile at memories of my mother without the overwhelming grief, to acknowledge the hurt without letting it dictate every aspect of my life. I discovered that true strength was not the absence of pain, but the courage to face it head-on and to use it as a stepping stone toward personal growth. The house, once a symbol of my mother's legacy and now a battleground of my father's new beginnings, continued to stand as a silent witness to our family's transformation. I often found myself returning there, not as a prisoner of old wounds, but as a seeker of closure. I walked through its familiar corridors, touching the worn banister and pausing at the windows where sunlight still danced in the dust. In those quiet moments, I allowed myself to grieve for what had been lost, even as I began to appreciate the fragile beauty of impermanence. It was a bittersweet dance, one that reminded me that every ending bore within it the seed of a new beginning. Through all this turmoil, I clung to the memory of my mother's gentle spirit as both a guiding light and a reminder of the love that had once defined our family. I resolved to honor her legacy not by rejecting change outright, but by finding a way to weave the threads of the past into a tapestry that could support the future. I began volunteering at a local shelter, offering my time to help those who, like me, had experienced loss and abandonment. In their stories, I recognized echoes of my own, and together we found that shared vulnerability could be transformed into a source of strength and compassion. Every day brought new challenges and small victories. I learned to negotiate the delicate balance between forgiveness and self-respect, realizing that accepting my father's new reality did not mean erasing the memory of my mother. Instead, it meant embracing the complexity of our lives, acknowledging the pain, the love, and the inevitable changes that time brings. I started to rebuild relationships with family members who had once distanced themselves in the wake of my father's decision, reaching out with tentative hope that reconciliation was possible. In these moments, I discovered that even the most fractured bonds could be mended, if only with patience, honesty, and a willingness to let go of past resentments. By the time winter gave way to the tender arrival of spring, I sensed that a new chapter was dawning, not one defined solely by my loss or my father's imperatives, but one where I could finally claim a voice in my own destiny. The journey was far from over, and many nights I still wrestled with doubts and memories that threatened to pull me back into despair. Yet, each time I looked in the mirror, I saw a person who had endured profound betrayal and emerged with a quietly defined strength. I had learned that life's most brutal upheavals, though painful, could also be the catalyst for profound personal transformation. And so, with each passing day, I took one more step forward into the uncertain future, guided by the lessons of the past and the promise of a new beginning. I knew that there would be setbacks, moments of heartbreak and lingering doubt, but I also recognized that I had cultivated an inner resilience that no external force could extinguish. My heart, though scarred, was open to the possibility of healing, and I was determined to honor the memory of my mother by living a life of authenticity, compassion, and courage. In the twilight of that turbulent season, when the last vestiges of my mother's memory mingled with the new, unyielding reality of my father's ultimatum, I reached a point of reckoning that reshaped the very core of who I was. The days had grown longer and the nights, though still heavy with memories, began to whisper of new beginnings. I realized that to truly honor my mother's legacy and reclaim my future, I had to choose a path that was entirely my own, even if it meant redefining family and forgiveness on my own terms. I recall the morning I finally made my decision as if it were a turning point in a long-forgotten dream. The soft light of dawn filtered through the curtains of my modest apartment, illuminating stacks of journal pages and canvases stained with the colors of both sorrow and hope. I sat at my little desk, the one I had inherited from my mother, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe without the constant, suffocating weight of resentment. I knew that the ultimatum, accept the marriage or empty the home, was not simply a demand for compliance. It was a symbol of my father's desperate need to move on, to fill a void he could no longer acknowledge, even if it meant tearing apart the sanctuary that had been my past. And so, with trembling determination, I resolved that I would not let his choices dictate my identity. I began by taking small, deliberate steps toward independence. I enrolled in a series of workshops that taught creative writing and personal expression, fields that allowed me to channel the overwhelming cascade of emotions into something tangible. In those classes, I discovered kindred spirits, people whose lives had been upended by loss, betrayal, or unexpected change. We formed a fragile community, sharing our stories with unguarded honesty. One evening, as we gathered in a cozy circle in a local community center, a fellow writer named Elena told me, "Every wound, no matter how deep, is a doorway to who we can become. Don't let the pain seal it shut." Her words resonated within me, igniting a spark that pushed me to continue exploring the parts of myself I had long hidden away. As I ventured further on this path of self-discovery, I began to see that healing was not a linear process but a mosaic, each piece a mixture of grief, anger, acceptance, and hope. I revisited old family photographs and mementos with a newfound clarity. I allowed myself to smile at memories of my mother's gentle laugh, the way she'd braid my hair on lazy Sunday afternoons, and the quiet moments when we'd sit together in the garden, watching the seasons change. Those recollections, once shrouded in pain by my father's harsh decree, now became a wellspring of strength. They reminded me that while one chapter had closed abruptly, her spirit, and the love she had instilled in me, would always be my guide. I also found myself increasingly drawn to the familiar streets of our old neighborhood. I began taking long walks along the cracked sidewalks, where the echo of children's laughter and the distant hum of daily life served as a reminder that life persisted, despite our personal tragedies. During these solitary wanderings, I discovered a quiet resilience in the people around me. The elderly neighbor who still tended her small garden with unwavering care, the shopkeeper who greeted every customer by name, the stray cat that meandered the streets with a nonchalant grace. In their simple, enduring routines, I saw a reflection of my own potential to rebuild, slowly, painstakingly, but undeniably. Meanwhile, the unresolved tension with my father loomed like a storm cloud over my heart. I knew that the confrontation we had shared at that quiet cafe was only the beginning. There were wounds to be healed and bridges to be rebuilt, even if I wasn't sure I could ever fully forgive him. Determined to understand his perspective, and to find a way to mend our fractured relationship, I reached out once more. I sent him a carefully written letter, pouring out my thoughts without anger, but with a raw honesty that left nothing unsaid. In that letter, I recounted my memories of my mother, my own struggles with grief and the crushing burden of his ultimatum, and my hope that we could, together, forge a new kind of family bond, one that acknowledged the past without being chained to it. Weeks passed before I received his reply. When it finally arrived, I read it with a mix of trepidation and anticipation. His words were tentative at first, apologies interwoven with the quiet admission of his own vulnerabilities. He wrote of sleepless nights haunted by regret, of the loneliness that had driven him to seek comfort in a new relationship even as it cost him the warmth of our once united family. "I know I hurt you," he confessed in a few carefully chosen lines, "and for that, I am truly sorry. I wish I could go back and change everything. I hope, in time, you might find it in your heart to forgive me, not for my sake, but for the sake of the family we once cherished." Though his words did not erase the past, they opened a door, a fragile possibility for reconciliation. Emboldened by his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes, I agreed to meet him again. This time, the conversation was less about assigning blame and more about understanding the choices that had led us here. We met in a quiet park, the one where I had once confronted the memories of my mother in solitude. The air was crisp, and the trees stood tall and silent, bearing witness to our tentative steps toward healing. I listened as he spoke of the isolation he felt after my mother's passing, how her absence had left a void he thought could be filled with the promise of a new beginning. In his voice, I detected a mix of regret and desperation, a realization that his actions, though misguided, stemmed from a deep, aching loneliness. Our conversation was filled with long pauses and heavy silences, moments when the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I expressed how his ultimatum had felt like an ultimatum not only on the physical space of our home but on the emotional space I needed to mourn and remember. I told him, "Dad, I cannot simply erase the love I have for Mom, nor can I forget the life we shared with her in it. I need to honor that memory, even if it means redefining what family means to us now." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, and for a moment, I sensed that we were both willing to embark on the difficult path of rebuilding trust, a path that would require patience, empathy, and a willingness to let go of old grievances. Over the following months, our meetings became more frequent and less charged with anger. Slowly, as if through a series of small, deliberate gestures, the chasm between us began to narrow. We started sharing meals together again, simple dinners at the old dining table where my mother used to set out her favorite china, each meal a silent homage to the past and a tentative celebration of our future. I even met her new partner, a gentle soul whose presence, while a constant reminder of my father's new life, also seemed to carry no malice. In time, I found that I could share a conversation with him that wasn't laced with bitterness but rather an acknowledgement that life, in all its complexity, moves forward regardless of our wishes. The process of reconciliation was neither swift nor smooth. There were days when the old pain flared up unexpectedly, a misplaced word, a lingering glance that recalled the ultimatum, a memory that threatened to unravel the fragile progress we had made. On those days, I would retreat to the sanctuary of my art, picking up my brushes and splashing colors onto canvas as a way to exorcise the lingering ghosts of my past. My paintings, raw and unfiltered, became visual testaments to the struggles I had endured, yet also to the hope that glimmered beneath the surface. They were expressions of a heart that had been battered by loss yet refused to yield entirely to despair. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves outside turned brilliant shades of amber and gold, I organized a small gathering at my apartment. I invited a few close friends from my creative writing and art workshops, people who had listened to my story and shared in my journey of transformation. That day, amid soft laughter and quiet conversations, I read aloud excerpts from my journal, the words that had chronicled every tear, every moment of defiance, every small victory on the road to healing. In that shared moment, I realized that my story, with all its pain and uncertainty, was not just mine alone. It was a narrative echoed in the hearts of many who had ever felt abandoned, betrayed, or lost. The act of sharing my truth with others brought an unexpected sense of liberation, a recognition that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit possesses an innate ability to rise, rebuild, and redefine itself. By the time winter gave way to spring, I had begun to envision a future that was no longer constrained by the memories of loss or the harsh demands of a past I could not change. I decided to move forward, not by erasing the legacy of my mother, but by building upon it. I curated a small exhibition of my paintings at a local community center, titling it Reclaimed Light. The show featured a series of canvases that depicted abstract representations of sorrow and renewal, swirling colors that moved from deep, melancholic blues and blacks to vibrant bursts of red, yellow, and green. Each piece was a declaration that even after profound loss, there is always the possibility of rebirth. The response was overwhelming. Strangers, moved by the raw vulnerability of my work, shared their own stories of heartbreak and hope, and for a time, I felt that the cycle of pain had been transformed into a shared celebration of resilience. Throughout this journey, I continued to hold on to the memory of my mother as a guiding light, a reminder that the love she had nurtured in me could never be extinguished, no matter how far the winds of change blew. I dedicated a quiet corner of my apartment to her memory, a small shelf with framed photographs, a vase of fresh flowers that I changed daily, and a handwritten note in her familiar script. Every morning, as I began my day, I would sit in that corner for a few moments, speaking softly to her as if she were there, offering thanks for the strength she had given me and seeking guidance for the road ahead. One particularly clear evening, as the first stars began to pierce the velvety dusk, I stood by my window and watched the city come alive with promise. I thought of all that had transpired, the funeral, the ultimatum, the long nights of solitude, the painful yet necessary confrontations, and the slow, often imperceptible, healing that had begun to take root. I realized that while I could never fully reclaim the past, I could choose to shape the future in a way that honored every part of me, the child who had known only love and laughter, the grieving soul who had faced the abyss of abandonment, and the resilient spirit that refused to be defined by despair. In that moment, I made a silent vow to myself. I would no longer allow the echoes of loss to dictate the rhythm of my life. I would embrace every day as an opportunity to honor my mother's memory by living authentically and with unbridled passion. I would celebrate the small victories, learn from the setbacks, and forge ahead with a heart that, though scarred, beat with the fierce determination of someone who had truly been reborn. And so, as the seasons turned and the scars of yesterday began to fade into the gentle tapestry of time, I stepped fully into the light of a new dawn. I chose to accept the complexities of my father's choices and the evolving nature of our family, not as an abdication of my grief, but as an acknowledgement that life, with all its painful twists, still held the promise of renewal. I embraced the man my father was becoming, a man who had learned, albeit too late, the cost of losing his family, and, in doing so, I freed myself from the chains of the past. Looking back now, I see that my journey was never about choosing between a forced new life and the empty echoes of what once was. It was about discovering that even in the wake of loss and betrayal, we have the power to rewrite our stories. My mother's legacy lives on in the quiet strength I carry, in the art I create, and in every small act of kindness I extend to those who, like me, have known heartbreak. Her gentle spirit continues to guide me as I navigate the unpredictable terrain of life, a life that, despite its scars, shines with the resilient promise of a new beginning. I stand here today, no longer defined solely by the pain of my mother's passing or the cold ultimatum of a father desperate to move on, but as someone who has transformed those very wounds into a testament to the enduring power of love, memory, and hope. My journey has been long and arduous, filled with moments of despair and bursts of unexpected joy, but it has taught me that every end carries within it the seed of a new start. In the quiet, reflective moments that now punctuate my days, I find solace in knowing that I am the author of my own destiny, a destiny built on the foundation of cherished memories, hard-won lessons, and the unyielding courage to embrace change. The home I once knew, with its echoes of laughter and loss, no longer confines me. It has become a part of the mosaic of my life, a reminder that even shattered pieces can be arranged into something beautiful and resilient. And so, with a heart open to the possibility of forgiveness, a spirit tempered by pain yet buoyed by hope, I move forward into the bright uncertainty of tomorrow. I choose to honor my past not by clinging to what is gone, but by celebrating the beauty of what remains, and by forging a future where every moment is a tribute to the strength of the human heart. The journey is far from over, and challenges will undoubtedly arise, but I now walk with the quiet confidence of someone who has faced the deepest sorrows and emerged, reborn, into the light.